mirror cracked down the center the day Carol Mitchell realized no man in Millbrook would ever look at her the same way again. She traced the jagged line with her fingertip, watching how it split her reflection into two fractured pieces, the left side bearing the raised pink scar that ran from her temple to her jaw like a lightning strike frozen in flesh. 3 months had passed since the fire at the textile mill, 3 months since the beam fell, and the burning timber carved its mark across her face. 3 months since she became the woman no rancher in town would consider for a wife. The mirror told the truth her heart refused to accept. She was damaged goods in a place where a woman's worth was measured in her ability to bear children and maintain a household, and scars suggested weakness, bad luck, or worse. Carol turned away from her reflection and smoothed her dark hair over the damaged side of her face. At 26, she had been considered one of the more eligible women in Millbrook, with her quick wit and capable hands. Now she was simply the scarred woman who lived alone in the cottage behind the bakery, surviving on the charity of her employer, Sarah Young, and the pitying glances of townspeople who whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. The morning sun slanted through her small window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden light. Outside, she could hear the familiar sounds of Millbrook coming to life, the clatter of wagon wheels on the dirt main street, the lowing of cattle being driven to pasture, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. It was a sound that had once filled her with contentment, the rhythm of a community where she belonged. Now it felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. Sarah's voice called from the bakery next door, sharp with the urgency of the morning rush. Carol wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, keeping to the shadows as she made her way to the back entrance. The bakery was already thick with the scent of fresh bread and the heat from the ovens. Sarah looked up from kneading dough, her round face flushed with exertion. "There you are," Sarah said, not unkindly but with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had little time for sentiment. "Mrs. Patel wants 6 loaves for the boarding house, and the Richardson boy came by asking for sweet rolls. Can you handle the front while I finish these?" Carol nodded, tying her apron with practiced movements. She had worked for Sarah for 2 years before the accident, and the older woman had been kind enough to keep her employed despite the whispers from customers who found her appearance unsettling. Still, Carol noticed how Sarah always found reasons for her to work in the back room when certain customers came calling, particularly the unmarried men who might once have lingered to chat with the pretty baker's assistant. The morning passed in a blur of familiar tasks, arranging pastries in the display case, counting coins, wrapping bread in brown paper. Carol kept her scarred side turned away from customers when possible, though she caught their furtive glances and heard their hushed conversations. The children were the worst, staring openly until their mothers pulled them away with sharp words about manners. It was nearly noon when Mark Ward pushed through the bakery door, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He was a successful rancher, 32 years old with broad shoulders and the kind of confident bearing that came from owning good land and prime cattle. Before the accident, he had shown interest in Carol, bringing her wildflowers from his property and lingering after church to walk her home. Now he barely looked at her as he ordered his usual dozen dinner rolls. "Afternoon, Mark," Carol said, keeping her voice steady as she reached for a paper bag. He glanced up briefly, his eyes catching on her scar before sliding away. "Carol." His voice was polite but distant, the warmth that had once colored their conversations notably absent. "How are you getting along?" "Well enough." She placed the rolls in the bag with careful precision, her movements deliberate to hide the tremor in her hands. "Your usual order?" "Yes." He counted out coins onto the counter, his fingers avoiding hers when she reached for the payment. "Give my regards to Sarah." He was gone before she could respond, the door closing with a decisive click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Carol stared at the coins he had left, seeing in their careful placement on the counter a distance that spoke louder than words. Mark Ward, who had once spoken of building a larger house with room for a family, now treated her like a stranger he was obligated to acknowledge out of politeness. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The afternoon brought more of the same, customers who averted their eyes, conversations that died when she entered a room, the constant weight of being seen as something broken. By evening, Carol's face ached from the effort of maintaining a pleasant expression, and her heart felt as heavy as stone in her chest. She was sweeping the front steps when Joyce Patel approached, her dark hair pinned severely back and her expression troubled. Joyce ran the boarding house with her husband and had always been cordial to Carol, though their relationship had never progressed beyond polite exchanges about business matters. "Carol," Joyce said, her voice carefully neutral, "I wanted to speak with you about the bread order." Of course, Carol leaned the broom against the door frame, sensing that this conversation would be about more than baked goods. "Is there a problem with the quality?" Joyce glanced around the empty street before stepping closer. "The bread is fine, as always. It's just—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Some of the men staying at the boarding house have been asking questions about who handles the baking, who they might encounter when they come to collect their orders." The meaning was clear enough. Carol felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from shame or anger, she couldn't say. "I see. I'm not saying this to be cruel," Joyce continued quickly. "You're a good worker, and Sarah speaks highly of you. But business is business, and if customers are uncomfortable, you'd prefer I remain in the back room when you come to collect your orders?" Carol's voice was steady, though inside she felt something crumble. Even Joyce Patel, who had always treated her with basic human decency, was now finding ways to avoid her presence. Joyce nodded, relief evident on her face. It would be easier for everyone involved. After Joyce left, Carol stood on the steps for a long time, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Millbrook, where Brook spread out before her like a painting, the neat rows of houses and shops connected by dusty streets that led to the surrounding ranches and farms. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where reputations were built over generations and a single moment could change everything. She thought of the life she had imagined for herself, marriage to a good man, children playing in a yard behind a house she could call her own. A place in the community that went beyond her ability to bake bread and count change. That future felt as distant now as the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The next morning brought news that sent ripples of excitement through Millbrook's small community. Edward Carter had arrived in town, a man whose reputation preceded him like the dust cloud kicked up by his wagon. He was a successful rancher from the eastern counties, recently widowed and looking to expand his holdings. More importantly, he was in the market for a wife. Sarah was practically vibrating with anticipation as she related the gossip she had gathered from the early morning customers. "Donna Cook says he's got over 3,000 acres and more cattle than you can count," she said, rolling out pie dough with more vigor than necessary. "And he's not hard to look at, from what I hear. 42 years old, but that's not too old for a woman looking to settle down." Carol listened with half an ear as she arranged yesterday's leftover pastries in the day-old section, marking them down to half price. She had learned to tune out conversations about eligible men and marriage prospects, finding them as relevant to her current situation as discussions of weather on the moon. "He's staying at the Patel boarding house," Sarah continued, oblivious to Carol's lack of enthusiasm. "Word is he'll be in town for at least a week, looking over properties and getting to know the local families. I imagine every unmarried woman in the county will be putting on her best dress and practicing her most charming smile." The bell above the door chimed, and Samantha Jimenez entered with her usual dramatic flair. At 23, she was widely considered the most beautiful woman in Millbrook, with glossy black hair and dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She was also the daughter of the bank president, which made her an even more attractive prospect for any man looking to establish himself in the community. "Sarah, darling," Samantha said, her voice carrying the slight accent that reminded everyone of her family's Spanish heritage and their claim to some of the oldest land grants in the territory. "I need something absolutely divine for tonight. I'm told Mr. Carter has been invited to dine with the Richardsons, and naturally I'll be there as well." Sarah beamed, clearly delighted to be part of whatever romantic campaign Samantha was planning. "I have some lovely petite fours that would be perfect, and perhaps some of those almond cookies you are so fond of." As Sarah bustled about preparing Samantha's order, Carol caught sight of her own reflection in the bakery window. The morning light was particularly harsh, throwing her scar into sharp relief and emphasizing the way she instinctively held her head at an angle to minimize its visibility. Standing next to Samantha, she felt like a moth beside a butterfly, drab and damaged where the other woman was vibrant and whole. Carol, Samantha said suddenly, and Carol realized she had been staring. How are you feeling these days? I heard you were making good progress with your recovery. The words were kind enough, but there was something in Samantha's tone that suggested pity rather than genuine concern. Carol managed a smile that felt like it might crack her face. I'm doing well, thank you for asking. I'm so glad to hear it. You know, I was just thinking that perhaps you might enjoy attending the church social next week. It's been too long since we've seen you at community gatherings. The invitation was clearly meant as a kindness, but Carol could read the subtext easily enough. Samantha was secure enough in her own beauty and prospects to afford generosity towards someone who no longer posed any competition. The scarred woman could attend the social and serve as a stark reminder to the eligible men of what they were not choosing when they looked at Samantha's perfect face. That's very thoughtful of you, Carol replied, her voice carefully neutral. I'll have to see how things are here at the bakery. After Samantha left with her carefully wrapped pastries and her satisfied smile, Carol found herself alone with Sarah, who was regarding her with an expression of motherly concern. You know, she means well, Sarah said gently. I know. Carol began wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. Everyone means well. You can't hide away forever, Carol. This is still your home. These are still your people. What happened to you was terrible, but it doesn't define who you are. Carol paused in her cleaning, her hands stilling on the wooden surface. Doesn't it? When people look at me, what do they see? They see the scar first, everything else second, if they see anything else at all. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than usual. I see a woman who survives something that might have broken someone else. I see someone who gets up every morning and does good work with dignity, even when the world seems determined to make her feel small. That's not nothing, Carol. The kindness in Sarah's voice was almost harder to bear than the pity or avoidance she encountered elsewhere. Carol felt tears threaten and turned away quickly, busying herself with unnecessary tasks until the moment passed. The day wore on with its usual rhythm of customers and small talk, but Carol found her thoughts drifting to Edward Carter and the stir his arrival had caused. She wondered what kind of man he was, whether he was as calculating as most men seem to be when evaluating potential wives, or if he might possess some measure of compassion that would allow him to see past surface imperfections. Not that it mattered. Men like Edward Carter, successful ranchers with property and prospects, didn't marry scarred women who worked in bakeries. They married bankers' daughters or ranchers' daughters, women who could bring connections and dowries to the union, women whose beauty would reflect well on their husband's status in the community. As afternoon faded into evening, Carol prepared to close the bakery and retreat to her small cottage. She was counting the day's receipts when she heard voices outside, loud enough to penetrate the bakery's thick walls. Curious despite herself, she moved to the window and peered out through the gap in the curtains. A small crowd had gathered near the general store, and at its center stood a man she didn't recognize. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by gray at the temples and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. This had to be Edward Carter, the man who had set the town's marriageable women into such a flutter of preparation and anticipation. He was speaking with Lionel Richardson, the town's most prominent citizen and owner of the largest ranch in the area. Even from a distance, Carol could see that Carter carried himself with quiet confidence, his posture straight but relaxed, his gestures economical and purposeful. There was something about him that suggested depth, a man who thought before he spoke and meant what he said. As she watched, Samantha Jimenez appeared as if by magic, resplendent in a blue dress that complemented her coloring perfectly. She inserted herself into the conversation with practiced ease, her smile bright and her manner animated. Carter turned to acknowledge her with polite attention, though Carol noticed that his expression remained neutral, neither impressed nor dismissive. The interaction lasted only a few minutes before the group dispersed, Carter heading in the direction of the boarding house, while Samantha walked away with a satisfied expression. Carol remained at the window, watching until the street emptied and the shadows grew long. That evening, Carol sat in her cottage with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, staring into the small fire that provided her only light. The events of the day played through her mind like scenes from a play she was watching, rather than living. She thought about Samantha's confident approach to Edward Carter, the way she had positioned herself to be noticed and remembered. It was a skill Carol had never possessed even before the accident, the ability to make herself the center of attention through sheer force of personality. She rose and moved to her small mirror, studying her reflection in the flickering firelight. The scar was less noticeable in the dim illumination, but she could trace its path from memory, every ridge and hollow as familiar as the lines of her palm. Sometimes she wondered what her life might have been like if she had left Millbrook after the accident, traveled to a place where no one knew her story, and she could reinvent herself as simply a woman with a scar rather than the scarred woman who used to be pretty. But leaving would have meant abandoning the only home she had ever known, the only work she was trained for, the only people who cared about her welfare, even if their caring came wrapped in pity. Sarah had been genuinely kind, offering her continued employment when other employers might have found excuses to let her go. Joyce Patel, despite her recent request for Carol to remain invisible, had never been deliberately cruel. Even Samantha's invitation to the church social, patronizing as it might have been, came from a place of attempting kindness. The problem was that kindness wasn't the same as acceptance, and acceptance wasn't the same as desire. Carol could count on the charity of others, but she could never again count on being wanted for herself, on being chosen rather than tolerated. A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Carol set down her teacup and moved cautiously toward the sound, wondering who would be calling at this hour. Through the small window beside the door, she could see a familiar figure silhouetted against the evening sky. Jeremy? She opened the door to find Jeremy Castillo standing on her small porch, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. Jeremy was one of the few men in town who had continued to treat her with normal courtesy after the accident, though she suspected that had more to do with his naturally reserved personality than any particular kindness toward her situation. "Evening, Carol," he said quietly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. Please, come in." She stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. Jeremy was a tall man, lean and weathered from years of working his small farm on the outskirts of town. At 34, he had never married, though not for lack of opportunities. There was something about him that kept people at a distance, a quality of watchful reserve that made him seem more comfortable with solitude than company. He stood awkwardly in her small living space, seeming to fill the room with his presence. Carol gestured toward the chair opposite her own, and he sat with careful precision, placing his hat on his knee. "I wanted to speak with you about something," he began, then paused as if reconsidering his words. "I've been thinking about your situation, and I have a proposition that might be of mutual benefit." Carol felt her heart begin to beat faster, though she wasn't sure whether from hope or anxiety. "What kind of proposition?" Jeremy was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his dark eyes were serious and direct. "I need help on my farm. The work is getting to be more than one person can handle, especially during planting and harvest seasons. You need a place where you can work without feeling like people are staring at you or whispering behind your back." "You're offering me employment?" Carol tried to keep the disappointment out of her voice. For a moment, she had allowed herself to imagine something else entirely. "I'm offering you partnership," Jeremy said carefully. "A marriage of convenience, if you will. You would have a home, security, meaningful work. I would have help with the farm and someone to manage the household. It wouldn't be a love match, but it would be a practical arrangement that benefits both of us." The words hit Carol like a physical blow, though she tried not to let her reaction show on her face. A marriage of convenience. A practical arrangement. Jeremy Castillo, one of the few men who had continued to treat her with basic human dignity, was offering her exactly what she was worth in her current state, a business transaction disguised as matrimony. "I see," she said slowly, buying time to process what he was suggesting. "And what would be the terms of this arrangement?" "Separate bedrooms, if that's what you prefer," Jeremy said, his voice steady but not unkind. "I'm not looking to take advantage of your situation. I'm simply offering a solution that might work for both of us. You're a capable woman, Carol. What happened to you doesn't change that, and I'm a man who values capability over conventional beauty. There it was, the acknowledgement that hung between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross completely. He was offering her marriage because she was no longer conventionally beautiful, because her options were limited and his were self-imposed. It was honest, at least, more honest than the polite fiction that most people maintained about her circumstances. I would need time to consider it, Carol said finally. Of course. Jeremy stood, retrieving his hat with the same careful movements he had used to place it on his knee. Take all the time you need. The offer stands, and there's no pressure either way. I simply thought it might be worth discussing. After he left, Carol sat staring at the dying fire and trying to sort through the tangle of emotions his proposal had stirred up. Relief that someone, anyone, was offering her a way out of her current limbo. Gratitude that Jeremy had approached her with honesty rather than false sentiment. Hurt that even his kindness came with the clear understanding that she was damaged goods, suitable for a practical arrangement, but not for genuine affection. And underneath it all, a stubborn ember of something that might have been hope or might have been simple rebellion against the idea that this was all she deserved. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to the bakery. Carol was arranging the morning's fresh bread when the door chimed, and she looked up to see Edward Carter himself standing in the entrance. He was even more imposing up close, with intelligent gray eyes and the kind of presence that suggested a man accustomed to being listened to when he spoke. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Carol couldn't quite place. "I was told this is the best bakery in Millbrook." "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Carol kept her scarred side turned away as she had learned to do, focusing on maintaining a professional demeanor. "What can I get for you today?" He studied the display case with the attention of a man making a serious decision. "I'm not familiar with the local specialties. What would you recommend?" The question seemed genuine rather than merely polite, and Carol found herself relaxing slightly as she pointed out various options. "The sourdough bread is particularly good, and Sarah makes excellent cinnamon rolls. If you're looking for something to take back to the boarding house, the fruit tarts travel well." "I'll take a loaf of the sourdough and 2 of the cinnamon rolls," Carter said, then paused. "And perhaps you could recommend something that would be appropriate as a gift for my hostess?" "Mrs. Patel has been very accommodating." Carol selected a small assortment of pastries, wrapping them carefully in the bakery's best paper. As she worked, she was aware of Carter watching her with the same serious attention he had given the display case. It wasn't the furtive curiosity she had grown accustomed to, but neither was it the careful avoidance that most people practiced. He seemed to be studying her the way he might study a horse he was considering purchasing, assessing her capabilities and value with professional detachment. "You're very skilled at that," he commented, as she paid the package with ribbon. "I've had plenty of practice." Carol counted his change carefully, her movements precise despite the unexpected nervousness his presence created. "How long have you worked here?" "Nearly 3 years." She hesitated, then decided honesty was preferable to the awkward dance most people performed around her situation. "I started before my accident, and Sarah was kind enough to keep me on afterward." Carter nodded as if this information was neither surprising nor particularly significant. Loyalty is a valuable quality in an employer, and skill is valuable in an employee. He paid for his purchases and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "I understand there's a church social next week. Will you be attending?" The question caught Carol completely off guard. "I hadn't decided. I hope you'll consider it. I find that community gatherings are the best way to understand a place and its people." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell. "Good day, Miss Mitchell." After he left, Carol stood frozen behind the counter, trying to process what had just occurred. Edward Carter, the eligible widower who had every unmarried woman in town vying for his attention, had not only spoken to her with normal courtesy, but had specifically asked about her attendance at the social. It was probably nothing more than politeness, the kind of inclusive gesture a man of good breeding might make toward anyone in the community. But it had been so long since anyone had asked about her plans or expressed any interest in her presence at a social gathering that even polite inquiry felt like a gift. Sarah emerged from the back room, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Was that Edward Carter? What did he want?" "Bread and pastries," Carol replied, trying to keep her voice level. and he asked about the church social. He asked about you attending the church social? Sarah's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. Well, I'll be. What did you tell him? That I hadn't decided. Carol Mitchell, you march yourself home right now and figure out what you're going to wear to that social. If Edward Carter is interested enough to ask about your attendance, you'd be a fool not to show up. He was just being polite, Carol protested, though she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope in her chest. Men like Edward Carter don't waste words on empty politeness, Sarah said firmly. He's a successful rancher looking for a wife, not a politician running for office. If he wanted to know whether you'd be there, he had a reason. The rest of the day passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Carol found herself alternating between cautious optimism and harsh realism, between the possibility that Edward Carter might see something in her worth pursuing and the certainty that she was setting herself up for disappointment. By evening, she had convinced herself that his inquiry was nothing more than the kind of general courtesy any well-mannered man might extend to any member of the community. She was closing the bakery when Jeremy Castillo appeared again, his timing so coincidental that she wondered if he had been watching for her to finish work. Carol, he said, his expression more serious than usual, I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday. Have you given any thought to my proposition? The question forced her to confront the choice that had been lurking at the edges of her consciousness all day. Jeremy's offer represented security, respectability, a chance to escape the pitying glances and whispered conversations that had become the background noise of her life in Millbrook. It was practical, honest, and probably the best opportunity she was likely to receive. But Edward Carter's unexpected attention had reminded her that she had once been capable of inspiring something more than pity or practical consideration. Even if his interest proved to be nothing more than courtesy, it had awakened something in her that she had thought permanently damaged along with her face. I'm still considering it, she said carefully. It's a significant decision. Jeremy nodded, his expression unreadable. Of course, I don't want to pressure you, but I should mention that I've heard talk about Edward Carter and his search for a wife. The competition among the eligible women is quite intense. There was something in his tone that made Carol look at him more closely. What are you suggesting? Only that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, Jeremy said quietly. Carter is a stranger here, and he'll be evaluating potential wives based on what serves his interest best. A successful rancher looking to establish himself in a new community will want a wife who enhances his standing, not one who might be seen as a liability. The words stung because they contained an uncomfortable truth. Carol had been foolish to read anything significant into Carter's polite inquiry about the social. Men of his stature and prospects didn't marry scarred women who worked in bakeries, regardless of how courteously they might treat them in public. You're probably right, she admitted. I'm offering you something real, Carol, something you can count on. Carter is offering nothing but the possibility of disappointment. As Jeremy walked away, Carol felt the weight of practical reality settling over her like a heavy blanket. He was right, of course. Edward Carter represented a fantasy, while Jeremy's proposal offered genuine security and companionship. She would be wise to accept his offer and stop torturing herself with impossible dreams. But as she locked the bakery door and prepared to return to her cottage, she found herself thinking not about Jeremy's sensible proposition, but about the way Edward Carter had looked at her. Direct and assessing, but without the careful avoidance she had grown accustomed to seeing in other men's eyes. The church social was still 5 days away. 5 days to decide whether to cling to practical certainty or risk everything on the slim possibility that someone might see beauty in her scars rather than despite them. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Carol noticed a lone rider approaching town from the east, his silhouette stark against the dying light. Something about the way he sat his horse, the purposeful pace of his approach, sent a chill of unease through her. Millbrook was a peaceful place, but the territories beyond were still wild and dangerous, and strangers arriving after dark rarely brought good news. The rider drew closer, and Carol could see that he was armed and travel-worn, his clothes dusty from hard riding. He pulled up at the sheriff's office and dismounted with urgent haste, his movements suggesting news that couldn't wait for morning. Whatever message he carried, Carol had the sudden, inexplicable certainty that it would change everything for everyone in Millbrook, including her own impossible choice between safety and hope. The writer's urgent message spread through Millbrook like wildfire before dawn broke. Carol learned of it when Sarah burst into the bakery an hour earlier than usual, her face pale with worry and her hands trembling as she tied her apron. "There's been trouble at the Henderson Ranch," Sarah said without preamble, her voice tight with anxiety. "Raiders hit them 3 nights ago, burned the house, took the cattle, and worse," she paused, swallowing hard. "Tom Henderson is dead, and his wife and daughter are missing." Carol's hands stilled on the bread dough she had been kneading. The Henderson Ranch lay 20 miles east of Millbrook, close enough that the smoke from their burning home might have been visible on a clear day. "Raiders? What kind of raiders?" "The kind that don't leave witnesses," Sarah replied grimly. "The messenger said it looked like the work of Jake Morrison's gang. They've been hitting ranches all through the eastern counties, getting bolder each time. Sheriff Wilson is organizing a posse, and every able-bodied man in town is expected to join." The implications settled over Carol like a shroud. If Morrison's gang was moving west toward Millbrook, every isolated ranch and farm in the area became a potential target. Jeremy Castillo's small farm, with its modest house and valuable livestock, would be particularly vulnerable. And Edward Carter, still new to the territory and unfamiliar with its dangers, might not understand the severity of the threat. Throughout the morning, the bakery became an unofficial gathering place for worried townspeople seeking news and comfort. Donna Cook arrived with red-rimmed eyes, having known Martha Henderson since childhood. Joyce Patel came seeking extra bread for the boarding house, where several travelers had decided to extend their stays rather than venture onto dangerous roads. Even Samantha Jimenez appeared, her usual composure cracked by genuine fear. "Papa says we should consider sending the women and children to the county seat until this is over," Samantha confided to Carol while Sarah helped other customers. "But Mama refuses to leave. She says running away never solved anything. And besides, where would we go? Morrison's gang could be anywhere by now." Carol found herself studying Samantha with new eyes. Stripped of her usual confidence and flirtation, the younger woman seemed smaller, more human. The threat of violence had a way of reducing everyone to their essential selves, and Samantha's essential self was apparently more vulnerable than her public persona suggested. "Your father is wise to be cautious," Carol said carefully. "But your mother is right too. Sometimes running just means dying tired." Before we continue this gripping tale, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and hype this video to help spread the word about these incredible frontier stories. By midday, the town had transformed into an armed camp. Men cleaned rifles and checked ammunition, while women gathered in groups, their conversations hushed and urgent. The sheriff's office became a command post where volunteers reported for duty and received assignments. Carol watched from the bakery window as Jeremy Castillo joined the growing crowd of armed men, his usually solitary demeanor unchanged despite the gravity of the situation. Edward Carter emerged from the boarding house carrying a rifle that looked well used despite his Eastern origins. He moved with the same quiet confidence Carol had noticed before, but now she could see the military bearing beneath his civilian clothes. This was a man who had faced danger before and survived it. "He served in the war," Sarah said, following Carol's gaze. "Joyce mentioned it this morning. Lost his first wife to fever while he was away fighting, came back to find his ranch burned by Confederate raiders. That's why he's looking to start over somewhere new." The information added depth to Carol's impression of Edward Carter. He wasn't just a successful rancher seeking a convenient marriage. He was a man who had lost everything once and was determined not to lose everything again. The knowledge made his earlier kindness to her seem less significant and more dangerous. A man who had loved and lost might be capable of seeing past surface imperfections, but he might also be too damaged to risk his heart again. The afternoon brought more disturbing news. A second messenger arrived with word that the Morrison gang had struck again, this time at the Murphy homestead, just 15 miles northeast of town. The pattern was becoming clear. The raiders were working their way systematically toward Millbrook, hitting isolated properties and growing bolder with each success. Sheriff Wilson called a town meeting for evening, and by sunset, every adult in Millbrook had crowded into the church. The sheriff, a grizzled man in his 50s who had kept the peace for nearly 2 decades, stood at the pulpit with the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. "Folks, I won't sugarcoat this," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary. "Jake Morrison's gang is heading our way, and they're not coming to trade horses. We've got maybe 2 days before they reach our area, and when they do, they'll hit the outlying farms and ranches first." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. Wilson raised his hand for silence. "I'm organizing the defense of this town, but I can't protect everyone. Families living on isolated properties need to make a choice. Come into town where we can defend you properly, or stay and take your chances alone." Lionel Richardson, the town's most influential rancher, stood up from his front row seat. "Sheriff, my ranch has good defensible positions and enough men to hold them. I'm not abandoning 20 years of work to a bunch of outlaws." "That's your choice, Lionel," Wilson replied, "but make sure you understand what you're choosing. Morrison's gang numbers at least 15 men, all experienced fighters. They don't take prisoners, and they don't leave witnesses." Carol found herself scanning the crowd for Jeremy Castillo and Edward Carter. Both men sat near the back, their expressions serious but unreadable. Jeremy's farm was particularly vulnerable, situated as it was on the eastern approach to town with no near neighbors to call for help. Carter, staying at the boarding house, was relatively safe for now, but his interest in purchasing ranch property would put him directly in the raiders' path. The meeting continued for another hour, with Wilson assigning guard duties and organizing supply runs for families choosing to ford up in town. Carol listened with growing unease as the reality of their situation became clear. Millbrook was about to become a target, and everyone she cared about was in danger. After the meeting dispersed, Carol lingered in the church, unsure where to go or what to do. Sarah had already left to prepare the bakery for a possible siege, and the streets outside buzzed with urgent activity as families made their final preparations. She was gathering her shawl when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Miss Mitchell." She turned to find Edward Carter approaching, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his expression grave. In the lamplight, she could see the lines of worry around his eyes and the way his jaw was set with determination. "Mr. Carter." Carol felt suddenly self-conscious, aware that they were alone in the dim church and that her scarred face was fully visible in the flickering light. "I wanted to speak with you about the situation," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I understand you live alone in a cottage behind the bakery. That's not safe with raiders in the area." Carol blinked, surprised by his concern. "I'll be fine. The cottage is close to town, and Sarah lives nearby." "Close to town isn't the same as in town," Carter replied firmly. "Morrison's gang won't respect the arbitrary boundaries between residential and commercial areas. If they hit Millbrook, they'll hit everything." "What are you suggesting?" Carter was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "The boarding house has extra rooms. Mrs. Patel has offered shelter to several families already. You should consider joining them." The offer was practical and well-intentioned, but Carol could imagine the awkwardness of sharing close quarters with Joyce Patel, who had already made it clear that Carol's presence made her customers uncomfortable. "That's kind of you to suggest, but I think I'll be fine where I am." "Will you?" Carter's voice carried a note of challenge. "Or are you letting pride put you in unnecessary danger?" The directness of the question caught Carol off guard. She had expected polite acceptance of her refusal, not this kind of pointed concern. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean that you're so accustomed to being treated as if you're invisible that you've started to believe it yourself," Carter said quietly. "You think no one would notice if something happened to you, so you're willing to take risks that a more valued member of the community wouldn't take." The words hit Carol like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She had become so accustomed to existing on the margins of Millbrook's social fabric that she had begun to think of herself as expendable, unworthy of the same protections and considerations extended to others. "That's not," she began, then stopped, unable to complete the denial. "It is," Carter said gently, "and it's wrong. Your life has the same value as anyone else's in this town, regardless of what some narrow-minded people might think about your appearance." Carol felt tears threaten and turned away, not wanting him to see her weakness. "You don't understand what it's like." "Don't I?" There was something in his voice that made her look back at him. In the lamplight, she could see a long, thin scar running along his left temple, barely visible unless the light caught it just right. I understand more than you might think. Before she could respond, the church door opened and Jeremy Castillo entered, his eyes quickly finding Carol and Carter in their quiet conversation. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly as he approached. Carol, Jeremy said, his voice carefully neutral, I was looking for you. We need to talk. Carter glanced between them, reading the tension in Jeremy's posture and the way Carol seemed to shrink slightly at his appearance. I'll leave you to your conversation, he said politely, but his eyes lingered on Carol with what might have been concern. Please consider what I said about the boarding house. After Carter left, Jeremy moved closer, his usual reserve replaced by something more urgent. What did he want? He was concerned about my safety, Carol replied, still processing Carter's unexpected revelation about his own scar. He thinks I should stay at the boarding house until the danger passes. He's right, Jeremy said bluntly, but there's another option. My offer of marriage still stands, and it would solve this problem immediately. As my wife, you'd have the protection of my name and my farm. I have good defensible positions and enough supplies to wait out a siege if necessary. Carol stared at him, trying to understand what he was really offering. You want me to marry you tonight, in the middle of a crisis? I want you to be safe, Jeremy replied, and I want us both to have what we need. The crisis just makes the practical benefits more obvious. There was something almost desperate in his tone, though his expression remained carefully controlled. Carol realized that Jeremy's proposal wasn't just about practical convenience. It was about fear. He was afraid of facing the coming danger alone, and he was offering her marriage as much for his own protection as for hers. Jeremy, she said carefully, are you asking me to marry you because you want a wife? Or because you're afraid to die alone? The question seemed to hit him like a slap. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might deny it. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, and she saw the truth in his eyes. Maybe both, he admitted quietly. Is that so wrong? We're all afraid right now, Carol. At least this way, we'd be afraid together. The honesty was both touching and heartbreaking. Jeremy Castillo, who had always seemed so self-sufficient and reserved, was revealing himself to be as vulnerable and lonely as she was. His proposal wasn't romantic, but it was real, born of genuine need and mutual understanding. I need time to think, Carol said finally. We don't have time, Jeremy replied urgently. The raiders could be here tomorrow night. If you're going to accept my offer, it needs to be now, before the danger arrives. Carol felt the weight of decision pressing down on her like a physical force. Jeremy was offering her immediate safety and security, a chance to face the coming crisis as part of the partnership rather than as an isolated individual. It was practical, honest, and probably the best option available to her. But Edward Carter's words echoed in her mind. Your life has the same value as anyone else's in this town. For the first time in months, someone had looked at her and seen not a damaged woman desperate for charity, but a person worthy of protection and concern. The feeling was intoxicating and dangerous, a reminder of who she had been before the fire changed everything. Give me until tomorrow morning, she said finally. If I'm going to make this choice, I want to make it for the right reasons. Jeremy nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. Tomorrow morning, then. But Carol, don't let pride or impossible dreams put you in danger. Sometimes the practical choice is the only choice that matters. After he left, Carol remained in the empty church, surrounded by shadows and the lingering scent of lamp oil. Through the windows, she could see the lights of Millbrook flickering like stars in the darkness, each one representing a family making their own desperate preparations for the coming storm. She thought about Jeremy's offer and Carter's concern, about the choice between safety and hope, between accepting her current circumstances and daring to believe she might deserve something better. The approaching raiders had forced everyone in town to confront their deepest fears and desires, and Carol was no exception. The next morning brought news that made everyone's choices more urgent. A third messenger arrived at dawn with word that Morrison's gang had been spotted less than 10 miles east of town, moving steadily westward. They would reach Millbrook's outlying properties by evening, and the town itself by the following day. Carol arrived at the bakery to find Sarah packing supplies into wooden crates, her movements quick and efficient despite the worry lines around her eyes. "I'm closing the bakery and moving everything valuable to the church basement," Sarah explained without looking up from her work. "Sheriff Wilson says it's the most defensible building in town, and we'll need a place to store food and supplies if we're under siege." Carol began helping with the packing, her hands moving automatically while her mind wrestled with the decision she had to make. Jeremy would be expecting an answer soon, and the approaching danger made delay impossible. "Sarah," she said carefully, "what do you know about Jeremy Castillo?" Sarah paused in her packing, giving Carol a sharp look. "Jeremy, he's a good man, quiet but reliable. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's never caused trouble for anyone." "Why do you ask?" "He's asked me to marry him." Sarah's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. "Jeremy Castillo asked you to marry him? Well, I'll be. That's unexpected." "Is it a good offer?" Carol asked, needing someone else's perspective on the choice she was facing. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "It's a practical offer," she said finally. "Jeremy has a good farm and a decent house. He's not the kind of man to treat a wife badly, and he's young enough that you could still have children if that's something you want. But, but, but marriage should be about more than just practical considerations, even for people in difficult circumstances. Do you care for him, Carol? Does he care for you?" Carol thought about Jeremy's proposal, his honest admission that he was afraid to face the coming danger alone. "I think we care for each other the way two lonely people can. It's not love, but it's not nothing either. Sometimes that's enough," Sarah said gently, "and sometimes it's not. Only you can decide which this is." They worked in silence for a while, packing bread and pastries that might have to sustain families through days of siege. Carol found herself thinking about the different kinds of courage required by the choices facing her. It took courage to accept Jeremy's practical offer and build a life based on mutual need and respect. But it also took courage to refuse that safety and hold out for the possibility of something more meaningful, even if that possibility was slim. The morning was nearly 9 when Edward Carter appeared in the bakery doorway, his rifle still slung over his shoulder and his expression grim. "Ladies," he said, touching his hat brim in greeting, "I wanted to check on your preparations. Are you planning to stay in town during the trouble?" "We're moving supplies to the church," Sarah replied. "Carol and I will be staying there with the other families who don't have men to protect them." Carter's eyes found Carol's, and she saw the same direct concern she had noticed the night before. "That's wise. The church has good stone walls and defensible positions." "What about you?" Carol asked. "Will you be staying in town as well?" "For now," Carter replied, "though I'll be riding with the sheriff's patrols to keep watch on the eastern approaches. We need advance warning if the raiders change direction or split up." The thought of him riding into potential danger sent an unexpected jolt of fear through Carol. "That sounds dangerous." "Everything is dangerous right now," Carter said quietly. "The question is whether we face that danger together or let it pick us off one by one." There was something in his tone that made Carol look at him more closely. She realized that his concern for her safety wasn't just general courtesy. It was personal in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. Edward Carter, the successful rancher who could have his pick of eligible women, was looking at her as if her welfare mattered to him specifically. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "why are you concerned about me in particular? You barely know me." Carter was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes serious and direct. "Sometimes you don't need to know someone long to recognize their worth," he said finally, "and sometimes circumstances force you to see what you might have missed under normal conditions." Before Carol could respond to Carter's cryptic statement, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the street outside. Jeremy Castillo was riding toward the bakery, his expression urgent and his horse lathered with sweat. He dismounted quickly and strode toward the door, his eyes immediately finding Carol. "I've been looking for you," he said, barely acknowledging Carter's presence. "We need to talk, now." Carter straightened, his posture becoming more alert. "Is there news about the raiders?" Jeremy's jaw tightened as he glanced at Carter. "Nothing that concerns you. This is a private matter between Carol and myself." The tension between the two men was suddenly palpable, like the electric feeling in the air before a thunderstorm. Carol realized that Jeremy saw Carter as a threat to his proposal, and Carter was beginning to understand that there was something significant between Jeremy and herself. "Perhaps I should leave you to your conversation," Carter said politely, but his eyes remained fixed on Jeremy with something that might have been calculation. "That would be about it," Jeremy replied curtly. After Carter left, Jeremy moved closer to Carol, his usual reserve cracking under the pressure of the moment. "You've had all night to think about my offer. I need an answer now." "Jeremy, please," Carol began, but he cut her off. "The Raiders will be here by tonight," he said urgently. "If you're coming with me to the farm, we need to leave now before the roads become too dangerous. And if you're coming as my wife, we need to find someone to perform the ceremony immediately." Carol felt the walls closing in around her, the weight of necessity crushing her remaining options. Jeremy was right about the practical realities. If she was going to accept his offer, it had to be now. But something in her rebelled against making such a momentous decision under duress, even when the duress was entirely reasonable. "What if I said no?" she asked quietly. "What if I chose to stay in town and take my chances with everyone else?" Jeremy's expression darkened. "Then you'd be making a mistake that could cost you your life. Carol, I'm offering you safety, security, and a chance at a real future. What more do you want?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them wanted to examine too closely. What did she want? Safety was appealing, security was necessary, and Jeremy's offer was genuinely kind. But standing there in the bakery where she had worked for 3 years, surrounded by the familiar smells of bread and pastries, Carol realized that what she wanted most was to feel valued for who she was rather than needed for what she could provide. "I want to feel like I'm being chosen rather than settled for," she said finally, the words coming out before she could stop them. Jeremy's face went pale, then flushed with something that might have been anger or hurt. "Is that what you think this is? Settling, isn't it?" Carol asked gently. "You said yourself that this would be a practical arrangement, a marriage of convenience. You need help on your farm. I need security and protection. It's a business transaction with legal papers." "What's wrong with that?" Jeremy demanded. "At least it's honest. At least it's real. What's the alternative, Carol? Wait around hoping that Edward Carter or some other man will see past your scars and fall in love with the woman underneath? That's a fantasy. And fantasies don't keep you safe when raiders come calling." The words stung because they contained enough truth to be devastating. Carol knew that her chances of finding genuine love and acceptance were slim, that Jeremy's practical offer might be the best she could hope for. But hearing it stated so bluntly made her realize how much she had been hoping for something more, even when she told herself she had given up on such dreams. "You're probably right," she admitted quietly. "Then marry me," Jeremy said, his voice softening. "Today, right now. We'll go to my farm, wait out this trouble together, and build something real based on mutual respect and shared need. It's not a fairy tale, but it's more than most people get." Carol looked at him, this decent man who was offering her everything she thought she wanted: safety, companionship, a place in the world where she belonged. Jeremy Castillo wasn't asking her to be beautiful or perfect. He was asking her to be useful and loyal, qualities she possessed in abundance. It was a fair trade, an honest bargain between two people who understood each other's limitations, and yet something in her heart rebelled against accepting it. "I need a few more minutes," she said finally. "Can you give me that much?" Jeremy's expression tightened with frustration. "Carol, we don't have minutes to spare. The longer we wait, the more dangerous the roads become." "Then go without me," Carol said, the words surprising her with their firmness. "If time is so critical, don't let my hesitation put you in danger." For a moment, Jeremy looked as if she had slapped him. Then his expression hardened into something cold and distant. "Fine. But don't come to me later asking for protection when you realize what you've given up. And don't blame me when you're lying dead in a ditch because you were too proud to accept help when it was offered." He turned and strode toward the door, his movements sharp with anger and hurt. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at her. "You think Edward Carter sees something special in you? But you're wrong. Men like him don't marry women like you, Carol. They use them when it's convenient and discard them when it's not. I was offering you something real, and you threw it away for a fantasy. After he left, Carol stood alone in the bakery, surrounded by packed crates and the lingering scent of his anger. Sarah emerged from the back room, her expression troubled. "I heard some of that," Sarah said carefully. "Are you sure you made the right choice?" Carol sank onto a wooden stool, suddenly exhausted by the weight of the decision she had just made. "I don't know. Maybe Jeremy was right. Maybe I am throwing away my only chance at security for an impossible dream." "What dream is that?" Sarah asked gently. Carol was quiet for a long moment, trying to put into words the feeling that had driven her to refuse Jeremy's practical offer. "The dream that someone might want me for myself rather than for what I can do for them. The dream that my scars don't define my worth as a person." Sarah nodded slowly. "Those aren't impossible dreams, Carol. They're just rare ones. The question is whether you're willing to risk everything to find out if they might come true." Before Carol could answer, the sound of gunshots echoed from the eastern edge of town, sharp and urgent in the afternoon air. Both women froze, listening as the shots were followed by shouting and the thunder of hoofbeats. Through the bakery window, Carol could see people running in the streets, some toward the church and others toward their homes to gather weapons and loved ones. "They're here," Sarah whispered, her face going pale. "The raiders are here." The reality of their situation crashed over Carol like a wave. Jeremy had been right about the timing. The raiders had arrived sooner than expected, and now she was trapped in town with no protection except what the community could provide. She had gambled her safety on the possibility of finding something better than a marriage of convenience, and now she would discover whether that gamble had been wisdom or fatal foolishness. More gunshots rang out, closer this time, and Carol could hear Sheriff Wilson's voice shouting orders to his men. Through the chaos, she caught sight of Edward Carter running toward the sound of the fighting, his rifle in his hands and his face set with grim determination. The sight of him heading into danger sent a jolt of fear through her that was entirely different from her general anxiety about the raid. This was personal, specific, the terror of watching someone she cared about walk into mortal peril. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere in the brief time she had known Edward Carter, she had begun to care for him in a way that went far beyond gratitude for his kindness. And now he was about to risk his life defending a town that included her, while she stood helpless in a bakery, protected by nothing more substantial than stone walls and desperate hope. The battle for Millbrook had begun, and Carol Mitchell was about to discover whether her choice to refuse safety had been an act of courage or the last mistake she would ever make. The first wave of raiders hit the eastern edge of Millbrook like a storm breaking against a cliff. Carol pressed herself against the bakery window, watching in horrified fascination as armed men on horseback swept down the main street, firing at anything that moved. The sound was deafening. Gunshots, shouting, the screams of wounded horses, and underneath it all, the terrible silence that followed when someone fell and didn't get back up. Sheriff Wilson had positioned his men well, using the buildings as cover and creating crossfire zones that forced the raiders to either retreat or dismount and fight on foot. Carol could see muzzle flashes from windows and doorways, the defenders of Millbrook giving as good as they got despite being outnumbered. "We need to get to the church," Sarah said urgently, grabbing Carol's arm. "It's not safe here." But Carol couldn't move, transfixed by the sight of Edward Carter crouched behind a wagon in the middle of the street, his rifle speaking with methodical precision. Even at this distance, she could see the calm competence with which he moved, choosing his targets carefully and making every shot count. This was not the polite rancher who had bought bread from her bakery. This was a soldier, a man who had faced death before and knew how to deal it in return. A raider on horseback broke through the defensive line, racing toward the bakery with his pistol drawn. Carol saw him coming and felt time slow to a crawl, her mind registering details with crystalline clarity. The man's scarred face, the foam on his horse's mouth, the way his gun was aimed directly at the bakery window where she stood. The window exploded inward in a shower of glass and lead, and Carol threw herself to the floor as bullets whined overhead. Sarah screamed, and Carol felt something warm and wet on her cheek that might have been blood or might have been tears. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and she realized the raider was coming closer, probably planning to finish what he had started. Then another rifle spoke, sharp and authoritative, and the hoofbeats stopped abruptly. Carol raised her head cautiously and saw the raider lying motionless in the street, his horse standing nearby with its reins dragging in the dust. 50 yards away, Edward Carter was already turning his attention to another target, his face grim with concentration. He had saved her life without hesitation, without even looking to see if she was grateful. The knowledge sent something warm and fierce through her chest, a feeling she had almost forgotten she was capable of experiencing. "Carol!" Sarah was beside her, checking for injuries with hands that shook but remained steady enough to be useful. "Are you hurt?" Carol took inventory of herself and found only minor cuts from flying glass. "I'm fine, but we need to get out of here." They gathered what supplies they could carry and made their way toward the church, keeping to the shadows and moving when the sound of gunfire provided cover for their footsteps. The streets of Millbrook had become a battlefield. With bodies lying where they had fallen and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air like fog, the church was already crowded with families who had heeded Sheriff Wilson's advice to seek shelter in the most defensible building. Donna Cook was there with her 3 children, her face pale but determined as she helped organize supplies. Joyce Patel moved among the refugees with quiet efficiency, distributing blankets and checking on the wounded. Even Samantha Jimenez was present, though she looked smaller and more fragile than Carol had ever seen her, her usual confidence replaced by the wide-eyed fear of someone confronting mortality for the first time. "How bad is it out there?" Donna asked as Carol and Sarah entered. "Bad enough," Sarah replied grimly. "They hit us hard and fast, but Wilson's men are holding them." "For now," added an older man Carol didn't recognize. "But Morrison's got more men than we do, and they're not fighting to protect anything. They can afford to take risks we can't." As if to emphasize his point, a fresh volley of gunfire erupted from somewhere near the general store, followed by shouting and the sound of breaking glass. Through the church's high windows, Carol could see smoke beginning to rise from the eastern part of town. "They're burning buildings," Joyce observed, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Trying to flush us out or destroy what they can't steal." The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably less than one. Carol found herself pressed against a window, watching for glimpses of Edward Carter among the defenders and feeling her heart stop every time she lost sight of him. She told herself that her concern was simply human compassion, but she knew it was more than that. Somehow, in the space of a few brief conversations, Edward Carter had become important to her in a way that went beyond gratitude or even attraction. The turning point came when Sheriff Wilson managed to outflank the raiders' main force, catching them in a crossfire that forced them to retreat toward the eastern road. Carol watched as the surviving attackers regrouped beyond rifle range, their leader a tall man with a black beard who had to be Jake Morrison himself. Even at this distance, there was something about him that radiated menace, a quality of casual violence that made her skin crawl. Morrison seemed to be arguing with his men, gesturing toward the town and then toward the road leading away from it. Carol couldn't hear the words, but the body language was clear enough. Some of the raiders wanted to press the attack, while others had had enough of Millbrook's determined resistance. Finally, Morrison raised his hand in a gesture that might have been farewell or threat, and the surviving raiders wheeled their horses and rode east, leaving behind their dead and whatever loot they had hoped to claim. A ragged cheer went up from the defenders, but it was a subdued celebration. They had won this battle, but everyone knew that Morrison's gang was still intact and still dangerous. As the immediate danger passed, people began to emerge from their hiding places to assess the damage. Carol left the church with the others, her eyes automatically searching the crowd for Edward Carter. She found him near the sheriff's office, helping to carry a wounded man inside. His shirt was torn and stained with what might have been his own blood or someone else's, but he was moving under his own power and seemed to be intact. Their eyes met across the chaotic street, and something passed between them that was too complex for words. Relief, gratitude, recognition of shared danger survived. Carter nodded to her once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement of her safety and promise of future conversation, then turned back to his duties. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity as the town dealt with the aftermath of the attack. 3 defenders had been killed, including old Pete Martinez, who had worked at the livery stable for 30 years. 7 more were wounded, though none critically. The raiders had lost at least 8 men, their bodies testimony to the accuracy of Millbrook's marksmen. Property damage was lighter than it might have been, though the general store had lost its front window and the schoolhouse bore bullet holes that would serve as permanent reminders of this day. The bakery's broken window seemed like a minor inconvenience compared to what others had suffered. As evening approached, Carol found herself helping Sarah clean up the glass and debris from their workplace. The familiar routine of sweeping and organizing was oddly comforting after the chaos of the battle, a return to normalcy that helped settle her nerves. "You realize what this means, don't you?" Sarah said as they worked. "What?" "Jeremy was right about the danger, but wrong about the solution. You didn't need a husband to protect you. You needed a community willing to fight for each other. And that's what we have here." Carol paused in her sweeping, considering Sarah's words. It was true that the community had protected her, but it was also true that Edward Carter had been the one to save her life specifically. The thought of what might have happened if he hadn't been there, if his rifle hadn't spoken at exactly the right moment, made her shudder. "Sarah," she said carefully, "what do you think about Edward Carter?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. "I think he's a man who knows how to handle himself in a crisis. I also think he's been paying attention to you in a way that goes beyond casual courtesy." "What does that mean?" "It means," Sarah said with a slight smile, "that maybe Jeremy was wrong about more than just the danger. Maybe men like Edward Carter do sometimes see past surface imperfections to the person underneath." Before Carol could respond, a knock at the bakery door interrupted their conversation. Through the broken window, she could see Edward Carter standing outside, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. Her heart began to beat faster as Sarah moved to unlock the door. "Mr. Carter," Sarah said warmly, "come in, please. We were just cleaning up." Carter entered, his eyes immediately finding Carol's. "I wanted to check on you both, make sure you weren't hurt in the fighting." "We're fine, thanks to you," Carol replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I saw what you did. You saved my life." Carter shrugged as if shooting armed raiders was simply part of his daily routine. "I was in the right place at the right time. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," Carol said quietly. "Not everyone has the skill or the courage to act when it matters." Something shifted in Carter's expression, a softening that made him look less like a soldier and more like the man who had bought bread from her just days ago. "I'm glad you're safe," he said simply. The words were ordinary, but the way he said them was not. There was something in his voice that spoke of personal investment, of genuine concern that went beyond neighborly duty. Carol felt her cheeks warm under his gaze and was suddenly acutely aware of her appearance. Her hair disheveled from the day's chaos, her dress stained with dust and small spots of blood from the flying glass, her scar fully visible in the lamplight. But Carter didn't seem to notice any of that. He was looking at her the same way he had looked at her before the attack, with that direct, assessing gaze that somehow managed to be both respectful and intensely personal. "Mr. Carter," she said, gathering her courage, "I want to thank you properly. Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow evening? I'm not much of a cook, but I could manage something simple." The invitation hung in the air between them like a bridge that neither could cross without changing everything. Carol felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for Carter's response, acutely aware that she had just taken a step that could lead either to happiness or devastating rejection. Carter was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes serious as he studied her face. Carol forced herself to meet his gaze directly, refusing to turn away or hide behind her hair as she had learned to do with other men. If he was going to reject her, she wanted to face it with whatever dignity she could muster. "I would be honored to have dinner with you," Carter said finally, his voice carrying a warmth that made Carol's knees feel suddenly weak. "But I have a condition." Carol's heart sank. Of course there would be conditions. Men like Edward Carter didn't accept dinner invitations from scarred women without carefully negotiating the terms. "What condition?" "Let me cook for you instead," Carter said, and his slight smile transformed his entire face. "I'm probably better at it than you are, and after what you've been through today, you shouldn't have to worry about preparing a meal." The response was so unexpected that Carol could only stare at him for a moment. You want to cook for me? I spent 4 years in the army learning to make something edible out of whatever ingredients were available, Carter replied. It's not a skill I get to use very often these days, but I think I remember the basics. Sarah, who had been pretending to busy herself with cleaning while obviously listening to every word of their conversation, spoke up with barely contained amusement. Carol, I think you should accept the man's offer. It's not every day a woman gets a chance to be cooked for by a gentleman. Then yes, Carol said, feeling as if she were stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. I accept your condition. Good, Aunt, Carter said, and his smile widened. Tomorrow evening. Then, shall we say 7 o'clock? After he left, Carol stood in the middle of the bakery, feeling as if the world had shifted on its axis. In the space of a single day, she had refused a practical marriage proposal, survived a raid by dangerous outlaws, and accepted a dinner invitation from a man who seemed to see her as something more than damaged goods. Well, Sarah said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them, that was interesting. Sarah, Carol said slowly, what am I doing? Jeremy was right about men like Edward Carter. They don't marry women like me. They might be kind to us. They might even enjoy our company. But when it comes time to choose a wife, they choose someone who enhances their standing in the community, Sarah finished. Someone beautiful and well-connected. Someone who can give them children and reflect well on their success. Exactly. Carol sank onto a wooden stool, suddenly exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the day. So what am I doing accepting dinner invitations and pretending that this might lead somewhere? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Maybe you're doing what you should have done months ago, she said finally. Maybe you're remembering that you're a woman with value beyond your ability to work and your willingness to accept charity. Maybe you're giving yourself permission to want something more than just survival. And if I'm setting myself up for heartbreak, then you'll survive that too, Sarah replied firmly. You survived a fire that could have killed you, Carol. You survived months of pity and whispers and being treated like you were invisible. You survived a raid by armed outlaws. I think you can survive whatever Edward Carter might or might not offer you. That evening, as Carol lay in her small bed, listening to the sounds of Millbrook slowly returning to normal, she found herself thinking about the different kinds of courage required by the choices she had made. It had taken courage to refuse Jeremy's safe, practical proposal. It had taken courage to remain in town during the raid rather than fleeing to some distant place where her scars wouldn't mark her as different. And it would take courage to have dinner with Edward Carter tomorrow, knowing that the evening might end with confirmation that she was foolish to hope for more than kindness from a man of his stature. But as she drifted towards sleep, Carol realized that she was tired of making choices based on fear. For 3 months, she had allowed her scars to define not just how others saw her, but how she saw herself. She had accepted the role of the damaged woman, grateful for whatever scraps of kindness others might throw her way. Tomorrow evening, she would sit across a table from Edward Carter and allow herself to be seen as simply a woman sharing a meal with a man. Not a scarred woman grateful for charity, not a desperate spinster clinging to impossible dreams, but simply Carol Mitchell, a person worthy of attention and consideration in her own right. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Carol helped Sarah repair the bakery window and restock the shelves, but her mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. She found herself changing clothes 3 times, trying to find something that looked presentable without appearing as if she was trying too hard. She settled finally on a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and she arranged her hair carefully to minimize the visibility of her scar without completely hiding it. At precisely 7 o'clock, Edward Carter knocked on her cottage door. He was carrying a basket that smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread, and he had changed from his work clothes into a clean white shirt and dark trousers that emphasized his lean frame and broad shoulders. Good evening, he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious approval. You look lovely. The compliment hit Carol like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it sounded genuine. When was the last time someone had called her lovely? When was the last time someone had looked at her and seen beauty rather than damage? Thank you, she managed, stepping aside to let him enter. You didn't have to go to so much trouble. It wasn't trouble, Carter replied, setting his basket on her small table and beginning to unpack its contents. I enjoy cooking when I have the opportunity, and it's been too long since I had someone to cook for. As he worked, laying out plates and arranging food with the same methodical precision she had observed in his other activities, Carol found herself studying him with new eyes. This was a man who had lost his first wife to fever, who had seen his ranch burned by raiders, who had fought in a war that had scarred an entire nation. Yet here he was, taking pleasure in the simple act of preparing a meal for a woman he barely knew. "Edward," she said, using his first name for the first time, "why are you here? Really, I mean, why are you having dinner with me instead of with Samantha Jimenez or one of the other eligible women in town?" Carter paused in his unpacking, his hand stilling on a bottle of wine he had produced from the basket. When he looked at her, his expression was serious and direct. "Because," he said quietly, "I've learned that beauty fades and social connections mean nothing when your house is burning around you. I've learned that what matters is character, courage, and the ability to stand strong when everything else falls apart. And yesterday, when the shooting started, I watched you through that bakery window. You didn't run, you didn't hide, you didn't fall apart. You stood there and faced whatever was coming with dignity and strength." He moved closer, his gray eyes never leaving hers. "That's the kind of woman I want to share my life with, Carol. Not someone who looks good on my arm at social gatherings, but someone who will stand beside me when the world tries to tear us down." The words were more than Carol had dared to hope for, more than she had ever imagined hearing from any man, let alone one like Edward Carter. But even as her heart soared, a part of her mind remained cautious, protective of the hope that was beginning to bloom in her chest. "And my scars?" she asked quietly. "They don't matter to you?" Carter reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to and gently trace the path of the scar along her cheek. His touch was warm and careful, neither pitying nor clinical, but simply accepting. "They tell me you're a survivor," he said softly. "They tell me you've faced fire and lived to tell about it. They tell me you're stronger than you know and braver than you believe. Why would I see that as anything but beautiful?" And in that moment, standing in her small cottage with Edward Carter's hand gentle against her scarred cheek, Carol Mitchell finally understood what it meant to be truly seen, truly valued, truly chosen, not despite her imperfections, but because of the strength they represented. The evening that followed would change everything, but for now it was enough to stand in the lamplight and feel beautiful in the eyes of a man who saw her scars as proof of her courage rather than evidence of her damage. Outside, the town of Millbrook continued its recovery from the morning's violence. But inside the small cottage, two people who had both known loss and survival were discovering that sometimes the most unexpected connections are also the strongest, and that true beauty lies not in perfection, but in the courage to keep living, keep hoping, and keep believing in the possibility of love, even when the world seems determined to prove such faith foolish. But even as Carol allowed herself to hope, neither she nor Edward could know that Jake Morrison and his surviving raiders were making camp just 10 miles east of town, and that the morning's defeat had only made their leader more determined to claim what he saw as rightfully his. The battle for Millbrook was far from over, and the choices Carol and Edward made in the coming days would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of everyone they had come to care about. The most dangerous test of their newfound connection was still ahead. The dinner Edward had prepared was simple but perfect. Roasted chicken with herbs he had somehow procured, fresh bread that rivaled Sarah's best efforts, and vegetables cooked with a care that spoke of long practice feeding himself and others. They ate by lamplight in Carol's small cottage, the conversation flowing with surprising ease between two people discovering they shared more than either had expected. "You mentioned you served in the war," Carol said, cutting a piece of chicken with deliberate precision. "Was it difficult to come back to civilian life?" Edward was quiet for a moment, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "The war changes a man," he said finally. "You learn to see death as a neighbor rather than a stranger. You learn that everything you think is permanent can disappear in a single afternoon. When I came home and found my ranch burned and my wife buried, it felt like the war had followed me." Carol studied his face in the flickering light, seeing the shadows that crossed his expression when he spoke of loss. Is that why you came to Millbrook? To escape those memories? Partly, Edward admitted, but also because I learned something else during those years. I learned that running from pain doesn't heal it, but building something new on top of the ashes sometimes can. The words resonated with Carol in ways she hadn't expected. She had spent months thinking of her scars as the end of her old life rather than the foundation of a new one. I've been running too, she said quietly. Not from a place, but from the person I used to be. I keep thinking that if I could just hide well enough, people might forget what happened to me. And what did happen to you? Edward asked gently. I've heard whispers about a fire, but I'd rather hear the truth from you. Carol set down her fork, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to tell the story she had avoided sharing with anyone except Sarah. There was an accident at the textile mill. A beam fell and knocked over a lamp, and the whole building went up like kindling. I was trapped near the back, and by the time I found a way out, the flames had. She touched her scar unconsciously. I was lucky to survive. You saved other people, Ben and Edward said, and it wasn't a question. Carol looked up at him in surprise. How did you know? Because that's who you are, Edward replied simply. I've watched you these past few days. You think about others before yourself, even when you're afraid. You wouldn't have been trapped in the back of a burning building unless you were helping someone else get out first. The accuracy of his observation left Carol speechless. She had never told anyone about Martha Gonzalez, the elderly woman who had been overcome by smoke near the mill's rear exit. Carol had dragged her to safety and gone back for Martha's granddaughter, and it was on that second trip that the burning beam had fallen across her path and the flames had marked her forever. Martha lived, Carol said finally. So did her granddaughter. That should have been enough. It is enough, Edward said firmly. The fact that you don't think so just proves my point about your character. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, both lost in thoughts too complex for words. As Edward helped clear the dishes, Carol found herself watching his movements with new appreciation. This was a man who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to respond with kindness. A man who had lost everything and was brave enough to risk building something new. Edward, she said as he prepared to leave. What happens now, between us, I mean? He paused at her door, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. That depends on what you want to happen. I want to believe that this is real, Carol replied honestly. But I'm afraid to hope for something that might disappear as quickly as it appeared. Edward moved closer, his gray eyes steady and direct. Carol, I've lost enough in my life to know the difference between something fragile and something worth fighting for. What I feel when I look at you, what I felt when I saw you in danger yesterday, that's not going anywhere. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused from years of hard work. I'm not asking you to trust me completely right now. I'm just asking you to give us a chance to see what we might build together. Carol felt tears threaten at the simple honesty of his words. I'd like that, she whispered. Edward smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost boyish. Good, then I'll see you tomorrow. After he left, Carol stood in her doorway watching him walk back toward the boarding house, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. For the first time in months, she felt something that might have been genuine happiness stirring in her chest. But her contentment was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple riders moving fast through the night. Carol pressed herself against the doorframe, peering into the darkness as the riders drew closer. In the moonlight, she could make out at least 6 men on horseback, their movements purposeful and coordinated. Fear shot through her as she recognized the lead rider's silhouette. Jake Morrison had returned to Millbrook, and this time he wasn't announcing his presence with gunfire and chaos. This was a stealth approach, the kind that suggested a specific target rather than general mayhem. Carol slipped back inside her cottage and blew out the lamp, plunging the small space into darkness. Through her window, she could see the riders spreading out through the town streets, their horses moving at a careful walk that would minimize noise. Whatever Morrison was planning, he wanted to achieve it without alerting the sheriff or the other defenders. She watched in growing horror as 2 of the riders dismounted near the boarding house where Edward was staying. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this kind of work before, one taking position near the front door while the other disappeared around the back of the building. Carol's mind raced through her options. She could try to reach the sheriff's office, but that would mean crossing open ground where the raiders might see her. She could hide in her cottage and hope they weren't interested in her specifically, but that would mean abandoning Edward and the other people staying at the boarding house to whatever Morrison had planned. Or she could try to warn Edward directly, accepting the risk that comes with choosing action over safety. The decision took less than a heartbeat. Carol grabbed her heaviest shawl and slipped out her back door, using the shadows between buildings to make her way toward the boarding house. She had spent her entire life in Millbrook and knew every alley and shortcut, every place where the darkness was deepest and the cover most complete. She was halfway to her destination when she heard the first scream. The sound came from the boarding house, a woman's voice raised in terror and pain. Carol recognized Joyce Patel's distinctive accent even in her distress, and the knowledge that the kind woman who had sheltered so many travelers was now in danger sent a surge of rage through Carol's fear. She pressed herself against the wall of the general store, trying to see what was happening at the boarding house without exposing herself to the raiders' view. Through the windows, she could see the flicker of lamplight and moving shadows that suggested violence in progress. More screams echoed through the night, some from women and others from men, creating a symphony of terror that made Carol's stomach clench with nausea. Morrison's voice cut through the chaos, loud enough to carry across the street. "Where is he? The Eastern rancher who thinks he can play soldier in our territory?" They were looking for Edward specifically. This wasn't a random raid or even a revenge attack against the town that had defeated them earlier. Morrison had come back for Edward Carter, and he was willing to torture innocent people to find him. Carol forced herself to think past her fear and anger. Edward was staying in room 7 on the second floor of the boarding house facing the main street. If he was smart, he would have heard the commotion and either escaped through his window or barricaded himself inside to make a stand. But if Morrison's men had surrounded the building as thoroughly as it appeared, escape might not be possible. She needed help, but the sheriff's office was 3 blocks away, and there was no guarantee that Wilson and his deputies would arrive in time to prevent whatever Morrison was planning. The other men in town were scattered throughout the residential areas, probably unaware that the raiders had returned. Another scream from the boarding house, this one definitely male, decided the matter for Carol. She couldn't reach the sheriff in time, and she couldn't abandon Edward and the other victims to Morrison's mercy while she ran for help that might arrive too late. Carol Mitchell, the scarred woman who had spent months hiding from the world's attention, was about to do something that would guarantee she would never be invisible again. She made her way to the back of the blacksmith shop, where she knew Tom Wilson kept emergency supplies for the volunteer fire brigade. The building was locked, but Carol had helped Sarah deliver bread here often enough to know that Tom kept a spare key hidden under a loose stone near the rear entrance. Inside the shop, she found what she was looking for, a bell used to summon the fire brigade in case of emergency. It was designed to be heard throughout the town, loud enough to wake sleeping families and alert them to danger. Carol had never rung it herself, but she had heard it tested often enough to know exactly how it worked. She grabbed the rope and began pulling with all her strength, sending the bell's urgent clang echoing through the night air. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space of the shop, but Carol kept ringing, knowing that every second of noise increased the chances that help would arrive before Morrison finished whatever he had planned. The bell's alarm had an immediate effect. Lights began appearing in windows throughout Millbrook as people woke to investigate the disturbance. Carol could hear voices calling to each other across the darkness, the confused questions of people trying to understand what was happening. More importantly, she could see movement near the boarding house as Morrison's men reacted to the unexpected alarm. Several of them emerged from the building, their attention divided between their original mission and the new threat represented by the town's awakening defenders. Carol kept ringing the bell until her arms ached and her ears rang with the constant clanging. Through the shop's windows, she could see armed men emerging from houses throughout the town, some carrying rifles and others grabbing whatever weapons they could find. Sheriff Wilson appeared at the far end of the main street, his distinctive figure unmistakable, even in the darkness. The tide was turning, but Carol knew it might still be too late for the people trapped inside the boarding house. Morrison's men would be desperate now, aware that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Desperate men with hostages were capable of terrible things. She abandoned the bell and slipped back outside, determined to get closer to the boarding house and see what was happening. The town was fully awake now, with people shouting questions and instructions to each other as they tried to organize a response to the crisis. Carol used the confusion to her advantage, moving through the shadows until she reached a position where she could see the boarding house's front entrance. What she saw there made her blood run cold. Morrison himself stood on the front porch, holding Joyce Patel in front of him like a human shield. Even in the dim light, Carol could see the knife pressed against the older woman's throat and the terror in Joyce's eyes. Behind them, through the open doorway, she could glimpse other figures that had to be Morrison's men and their remaining hostages. "Listen up, people of Millbrook," Morrison's voice carried clearly through the night air, pitched to reach the growing crowd of armed townspeople. "I've got 6 people in here, including your precious boarding house keeper. I want the Eastern rancher who calls himself Edward Carter, and I want him now, see? You've got 5 minutes to produce him, or I start cutting throats." Carol's heart nearly stopped as she processed Morrison's ultimatum. Edward was trapped inside the boarding house with Morrison's men, probably already captured or worse. The raider leader was demanding something that couldn't be delivered, which meant the hostages were going to die unless someone found another solution. Sheriff Wilson's voice answered from somewhere in the darkness, calm and authoritative, despite the circumstances. "Let the hostages go, Morrison. Your quarrel is with Carter, not with innocent people." Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Innocent? These people sheltered the man who killed 8 of my boys. They fed him, housed him, treated him like family. That makes them accomplices in my book." "What do you want with Carter?" Wilson called back. "What I want is to watch him die slow," Morrison replied, his voice carrying a venom that made Carol shudder. "He cost me good men and good horses, and he's going to pay for every one of them. But first, I want him to watch these nice folks die knowing how it's his fault." The casual cruelty in Morrison's tone made it clear that he had no intention of releasing the hostages regardless of whether Edward surrendered. This was about revenge and terror, not justice or even practical gain. Morrison wanted to hurt Edward in the most devastating way possible, and he was willing to murder innocent people to achieve that goal. Carol found herself thinking about Edward's words from dinner, about the difference between running from pain and building something new on top of the ashes. Morrison represented the running approach, responding to loss with more violence and destruction. Edward represented the building approach, choosing to create rather than destroy, even after suffering terrible losses. The town was faced with an impossible choice: sacrifice Edward to save the hostages, knowing that Morrison would probably kill them anyway, or attempt a rescue that might result in everyone dying. Either way, innocent people were going to pay the price for Morrison's twisted need for revenge. But as Carol crouched in the shadows watching the standoff develop, she realized that there might be a third option, one that no one else would consider because it required someone willing to make themselves visible when visibility meant mortal danger. Someone like a scarred woman who had already lost everything that mattered to her old life and was just beginning to discover what might matter in a new one. Carol's plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Morrison's men were focused on the boarding house and the growing crowd of armed townspeople gathering in the street. They weren't watching for a lone woman moving through the shadows behind the buildings, especially not one who knew every inch of Millbrook's layout from years of trying to remain unseen. The boarding house had been built with a root cellar accessible from the outside, a common feature in frontier buildings designed to provide cool storage for food and supplies. Carol had helped Joyce store preserves there during her first year working for Sarah, back when she was still considered a valuable member of the community rather than an object of pity. If she could reach the cellar entrance without being spotted, she might be able to get inside the building and create enough of a distraction to give the hostages a chance to escape. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than watching innocent people die while the town's defenders tried to negotiate with a man who had no intention of keeping his word. Carol made her way carefully through the maze of back alleys and storage sheds that connected Millbrook's commercial district. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness: the crunch of gravel under her feet, the whisper of her shawl against wooden walls, the rapid beating of her own heart. Several times she had to freeze in place as Morrison's men moved past her hiding spots. their attention focused on watching for approaching townspeople rather than searching for infiltrators. The cellar entrance was located on the boarding house's north side, partially concealed by a wooden lattice that Joyce used to support climbing roses. Carol reached it without being detected, though she could hear voices and movement directly above her head as Morrison's men maintained their positions throughout the building. The cellar door was secured with a simple wooden latch, designed to keep animals out rather than people. Carol lifted it carefully, wincing at the small creak the hinges made as the door swung open. The space beyond was black as pitch, filled with the earthy smell of stored vegetables and the mustiness of a space that rarely saw sunlight. Carol descended the wooden steps by feel, her hands trailing along the rough stone walls for guidance. At the bottom, she paused to let her eyes adjust to the deeper darkness and to listen for sounds from the building above. She could hear Morrison's voice clearly now, along with the occasional whimper or sob from his hostages. The cellar connected to the boarding house's main floor through a narrow staircase that emerged in the kitchen pantry. Carol had used these stairs before when helping Joyce with heavy deliveries, but never under circumstances where discovery would mean immediate death. She climbed slowly, testing each step before putting her full weight on it and pausing frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate someone was nearby. The kitchen was directly above her, and she could hear movement and conversation that suggested at least some of Morrison's men were using it as a staging area. At the top of the stairs, Carol pressed her ear against the pantry door and tried to make sense of what she was hearing. Morrison's voice came from the front of the building, probably the main parlor where Joyce normally entertained guests. Other voices, both male and female, seemed to be coming from various rooms throughout the first floor. Carol eased the pantry door open just enough to peer into the kitchen beyond. What she saw made her stomach clench with fear and anger. Two of Morrison's men sat at Joyce's kitchen table, casually eating food they had taken from the pantry, while their leader terrorized innocent people in the next room. Their rifles leaned against the wall nearby, close enough to grab quickly, but far enough away that they weren't immediately ready for trouble. One of the raiders was describing in graphic detail what he planned to do to Samantha Jimenez once Morrison finished with his revenge against Edward. The casual cruelty of his words, the way he spoke of violence and violation as if discussing the weather, filled Carol with a rage so pure and hot that it burned away her fear. These men had come to her town, threatened her friends, and were planning to destroy everything she had begun to care about again. They saw people like Joyce and Samantha as objects to be used and discarded, just as the townspeople had begun to see Carol as damaged goods after her accident. But Carol Mitchell was not damaged goods. She was a woman who had walked through fire and survived, who had faced the worst that life could offer and chosen to keep building rather than destroying. She was a woman who had been chosen by a good man, not despite her scars, but because of the strength they represented, and she was done being invisible. Carol slipped through the pantry door and into the kitchen, moving with a silence born of months spent trying not to be noticed. The two raiders were so focused on their conversation and their stolen meal that they never sensed her presence until it was too late. She grabbed the largest knife from Joyce's cutting block and drove it deep into the back of the first man's neck before he could turn around. He died without making a sound, his body slumping forward onto the table in a spreading pool of blood. The second raider had just enough time to register what was happening before Carol's knife found his throat. His eyes widened with shock and fear as he realized that his death had come not from an armed townsman or a sheriff's deputy, but from a scarred woman who had appeared out of nowhere like an avenging angel. Carol felt no satisfaction in the killing, only grim necessity. These men had chosen violence, and violence was what they would receive. She wiped the knife clean on one of their shirts and picked up both rifles, checking to make sure they were loaded and ready to fire. From the front of the building, she could still hear Morrison's voice raised in threats and demands. He was giving Sheriff Wilson another ultimatum, promising to start killing hostages if Edward Carter wasn't produced within the next few minutes. The desperation in his tone suggested that he was beginning to realize his position was becoming untenable as more armed townspeople gathered outside. Carol moved carefully through the boarding house's ground floor, using her knowledge of the building's layout to avoid the rooms where she could hear voices. Her goal was to reach the second floor, where Edward was most likely being held, but she needed to do it without alerting Morrison or his remaining men to her presence. The main staircase was too exposed, visible from the parlor where Morrison was holding his primary hostages. But there was a servant's staircase at the back of the building, narrow and steep, but concealed from the main rooms. Carol had used it before when helping Joyce with laundry and cleaning. She found the staircase and began climbing, one careful step at a time. The old wood creaked under her weight, but the sounds were masked by Morrison's continued shouting and the general commotion from outside the building. At the second-floor landing, Carol paused to listen and plan her next move. The boarding house had 8 guest rooms on the second floor, arranged along a central hallway. Edward had been staying in room 7, but there was no guarantee that's where Morrison's men were holding him. She would have to check each room systematically, hoping to find him before she was discovered. Carol started at the far end of the hall, away from the main staircase. The first 3 rooms were empty, their doors standing open to reveal unmade beds and scattered belongings left behind by guests who had fled when the trouble started. The 4th room was locked, which suggested it might contain something worth hiding. She pressed her ear to the door and heard what sounded like labored breathing from inside. Someone was in there, possibly injured or restrained. Carol tried the handle again, then used the knife to work at the simple lock until it clicked open. Inside, she found Edward Carter tied to a chair, his face bloodied and his shirt torn from the beating Morrison's men had given him. But his eyes were alert and angry rather than defeated, and when he saw Carol in the doorway, his expression shifted to amazement and concern. "Carol, boss," he whispered, his voice hoarse from whatever interrogation he had endured. "What are you doing here? It's not safe." "Nowhere is safe right now," Carol replied, moving quickly to cut his bonds with her knife. "Morrison is holding hostages downstairs and threatening to kill them if the town doesn't surrender you to him." Edward rubbed his wrist where the ropes had cut into his skin, his jaw tight with anger. "How many men does he have left?" "I've seen at least 4, not counting the 2 I killed in the kitchen." Carol handed him one of the rifles she had taken. "Can you fight?" Edward's smile was grim but determined. "Lady, after what those bastards put me through, fighting is about the only thing I want to do right now." They made their way carefully back toward the main staircase, Edward moving with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to fight in circumstances where mistakes meant death. Despite his injuries, he seemed to have regained his full strength and focus, transformed from a beaten prisoner into a dangerous predator stalking his captors. "Morrison is in the front parlor with the main group of hostages," Carol whispered as they reached the top of the stairs. "I heard at least 2 other voices, probably his remaining men positioned to watch the other entrances." Edward nodded, his gray eyes hard as flint. "He'll have someone watching the back door and someone covering the stairs. Standard tactics for holding a defensive position." "What's our best approach?" "We split up," Edward replied without hesitation. "You take the back entrance and create a distraction. When his men move to investigate, I'll come down the main stairs and hit Morrison from behind." Carol felt a chill of fear at the thought of separating from Edward, but she recognized the tactical wisdom of his plan. "What kind of distraction?" "Something loud enough to make them think the sheriff's men are breaking in through the rear of the building. Gunshots, shouting, anything that sounds like an organized assault." "And if something goes wrong, if they catch me before you can reach Morrison?" Edward's expression softened for just a moment, and he reached out to touch her scarred cheek with gentle fingers. "Then I'll kill every one of them or die trying. I promise you that." The simple sincerity of his words sent warmth through Carol's chest despite the mortal danger they were facing. This was what it felt like to be protected by someone who valued her life as much as his own, someone who would risk everything to keep her safe. "Edward," she said quietly, "after this is over, assuming we both survive, I want you to know that tonight has been the best evening of my life." His smile transformed his battered face into something beautiful. "Mine too. And we are going to survive this, Carol. Both of us." They separated at the bottom of the stairs, Edward melting into the shadows near the front of the building, while Carol made her way toward the kitchen and the rear entrance. The 2 dead raiders were still slumped at the table where she had left them, their blood beginning to congeal in dark pools on Joyce's clean tablecloth. Carol positioned herself near the back door and took a deep breath, preparing to create the kind of disturbance that would draw Morrison's remaining men away from their leader. She thought about the innocent people being held hostage in the parlor, about Joyce Patel's terrified face and the casual cruelty in Morrison's voice when he spoke of killing them. Then she thought about Edward, waiting in the shadows, counting on her to give him the opening he needed to end this nightmare. The scarred woman who had spent months trying to be invisible was about to make herself the center of attention in the most dangerous way possible. Carol kicked open the back door and began firing the rifle into the air, shouting at the top of her lungs as if she were leading a charge of armed townspeople. "They're in the kitchen. Take the back stairs. Don't let any of them escape." The response was immediate and exactly what Edward had predicted. Heavy footsteps thundered through the boarding house as Morrison's men rushed to meet what they thought was an assault from the rear. Carol heard Morrison's voice raised in urgent commands, though she couldn't make out the specific words over the chaos she had created. She kept up the deception for as long as she dared, firing shots and shouting orders to imaginary reinforcements. When she heard gunfire from the front of the building, she knew that Edward had made his move and the real battle had begun. Carol abandoned her position at the back door and fought her way through the boarding house toward the sound of combat. She found one of Morrison's men in the hallway, trying to decide whether to continue toward the kitchen or return to help his leader. The decision was made for him when Carol's rifle spoke from close range, dropping him before he could raise his own weapon. The parlor had become a battlefield. Edward had indeed caught Morrison by surprise. But the raider leader was an experienced fighter who had recovered quickly from the initial shock. The two men were engaged in a deadly dance around the room's furniture, using overturned tables and chairs for cover, while the hostages cowered in whatever protection they could find. Morrison was wounded, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, but he was still dangerous and desperate. His remaining man had taken position near the front window, firing at the growing crowd of townspeople outside while trying to keep Edward pinned down. Carol entered the parlor just as Morrison made a desperate lunge toward Joyce Patel, his knife gleaming in the lamplight as he sought to use the older woman as a human shield. Time seemed to slow as Carol raised her rifle, knowing that she had one chance to end this before Morrison could hurt anyone else. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and Morrison spun away from Joyce with a scream of pain and rage. Carol's shot had taken him into the shoulder, not a killing blow, but enough to make him drop his knife and stagger backward. Edward used the distraction to put a bullet through the chest of Morrison's last man, ending the threat from the window. Then he turned his attention to Morrison himself, advancing with deadly purpose while the raider leader clutched his wounded shoulder and looked around desperately for an escape route. "It's over, Morrison," Edward said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had seen too much death to take pleasure in it, but was prepared to deal it when necessary. "Surrender now, and you might live to see a trial." Morrison's laugh was bitter and defiant. "You think this is over? You think killing me ends anything? There are more like me out there, Carter. More men who've lost at everything and got nothing left to lose. You can't kill us all." "Maybe not," Edward replied calmly. "But I can kill you." Morrison's hand moved toward a hidden weapon, and Edward's rifle spoke with final authority. The raider leader crumpled to the floor, his reign of terror ended by the same violence he had brought to so many others. In the sudden silence that followed, Carol could hear the voices of the townspeople outside. Sheriff Wilson calling for confirmation that the threat was over. She looked around the parlor at the hostages who were beginning to emerge from their hiding places, all of them alive, despite Morrison's threats. Joyce Patel was the first to reach Carol, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude and relief. "Child," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "what you did tonight, there aren't words for such courage." "I just did what needed to be done," Carol replied, suddenly exhausted by the weight of everything that had happened. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Edward said, moving to stand beside her with his rifle still ready despite the apparent end of the danger. "Not anyone. What you did tonight took a special kind of courage, the kind that puts other people's lives ahead of your own safety." Sheriff Wilson and his deputies burst through the front door, weapons drawn and ready for battle. When they saw Morrison's body and the subdued hostages, Wilson's weathered face creased with relief and something that might have been pride. "Looks like you folks handled this yourselves," he said. his eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. Anyone hurt? Nothing that won't heal, Edward replied, though Carol could see that his injuries from Morrison's earlier beating were more serious than he was letting on. The hostages are all safe. Wilson nodded and began organizing his men to secure the scene and tend to the wounded. As the immediate crisis passed and people began to process what had happened, Carol found herself the center of attention in a way she hadn't experienced since before her accident. But this attention was different. Instead of pity or careful avoidance, she saw respect in the eyes of her neighbors, recognition of what she had accomplished. Samantha Jimenez, who had once invited her to social gatherings out of condescending charity, now looked at her with something approaching awe. "Carol," Samantha said, her voice soft with wonder, "you saved all of us. You could have stayed hidden and safe, but you risked everything to help people who haven't always been kind to you." Carol felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncomfortable with the praise but beginning to understand that something fundamental had changed in how the town saw her. "I couldn't just stand by and watch innocent people get hurt." "That's what makes you a hero," said Donna Cook, who had arrived with the crowd of townspeople drawn by the gunfire. "Heroes aren't people who aren't afraid. They're people who do what's right despite being afraid." As dawn broke over Millbrook, the town began the process of cleaning up after Morrison's final raid. The bodies were removed, the wounded were tended, and people started the difficult work of processing what they had witnessed and experienced. Carol found herself at the center of conversations she never could have imagined being part of, treated not as an object of pity, but as someone whose opinion and presence were valued. Edward had been taken to the town's doctor to have his injuries properly treated, but not before he had made it clear to everyone within earshot that Carol Mitchell was the reason the hostages had survived. His praise, coming from a man whose own courage was unquestionable, carried weight that transformed how people saw her. "I've been thinking about what happened last night," Sarah said, as she and Carol worked together to repair the bakery's damaged window. The glass had been shattered by stray bullets during the final confrontation, but the building itself was intact. "You know what it means, don't you?" "It means Morrison is dead and the town is safe," Carol replied, focusing on the practical task of measuring new glass rather than examining the larger implications of her actions. "It means more than that," Sarah insisted. "It means you've stopped hiding from who you are. That night, you didn't act like a scarred woman grateful for whatever scraps of kindness people might throw your way. You acted like Carol Mitchell, a person with value and strength and the right to protect the people she cares about." Carol paused in her work, considering Sarah's words. It was true that something had changed in her during the crisis, some fundamental shift in how she saw herself and her place in the world. For months, she had allowed her scars to define not just how others saw her, but how she saw herself. She had accepted the role of victim, of damaged goods, of someone whose best days were behind her. But last night, faced with a choice between safety and action, she had chosen to be the person she wanted to be rather than the person circumstances had tried to make her. She had chosen to be visible, to matter, to fight for something worth fighting for. "Maybe you're right," Carol said quietly. "Maybe I have been hiding. And maybe it's time to stop," Sarah replied with a smile, "especially since you've got a good man who sees you clearly and wants to build something with you." As if summoned by their conversation, Edward Carter appeared in the bakery doorway. His face bore the marks of Morrison's beating, and his left arm was supported by a sling. But his eyes were clear and determined. He moved carefully but steadily, like a man who refused to let injuries slow him down when he had important business to conduct. "Ladies," he said, touching his hat brim with his good hand, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Nothing that can't wait," Sarah replied with obvious delight. "Carol was just telling me how much she's looking forward to seeing you again." Carol felt her cheeks warm at Sarah's obvious matchmaking, but she found she didn't mind the embarrassment as much as she once would have. "How are you feeling? The doctor said you had some serious injuries." "Nothing that won't heal," Edward replied, his eyes fixed on Carol's face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I wanted to talk to you about what happens next." "Next?" Edward moved closer, his expression serious but not grim. "Morrison is dead, but his gang is scattered rather than destroyed. Some of them will probably try to regroup and continue raiding in other territories. The point is, the danger isn't completely over. And even when it is, there will always be other dangers. Carol nodded, understanding that he was talking about more than just the immediate threat from outlaws. Life on the frontier was inherently dangerous, filled with risks that could change everything in a single moment. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that people are stronger when they face those dangers together, Edward said quietly. I'm suggesting that what we discovered about each other last night is worth building on, worth protecting, worth making permanent. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Carol's heart race. She had dreamed of this moment for months, imagined what it would feel like to have someone choose her, not out of pity or convenience, but out of genuine affection and respect. Edward, she said carefully, are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking you to marry me, Edward replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. Not because you need protection or because I need a housekeeper, but because I love who you are and I want to spend my life with the woman who was brave enough to walk into a nest of killers to save people she cared about. Carol felt tears threaten, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. You love who I am? I love your courage, Edward said, moving close enough to take her hands in his. I love your compassion, your strength, your refusal to let circumstances define your worth. I love the way you see the world and the way you choose to act on what you see. And yes, I love your scars because they tell the story of a woman who walked through fire and came out stronger on the other side. Even though I'm not beautiful anymore? The question slipped out before Carol could stop it, a remnant of the insecurity that had defined her for so long. Edward's smile was gentle and certain. Carol, you are the most beautiful woman I have ever known, not despite your scars, but because of everything they represent about who you are. Sarah, who had been pretending to busy herself with cleaning while obviously listening to every word, spoke up from across the bakery. Carol Mitchell, if you don't say yes to that man right now, I'm going to hit you with a rolling pin. Carol laughed through her tears, feeling lighter than she had in months. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, Edward Carter, I will marry you. The kiss that followed was everything Carol had dreamed of, and more. A promise of partnership and passion that had nothing to do with pity or convenience, and everything to do with two people who had found something worth fighting for in each other. When they finally broke apart, Carol was aware that a small crowd had gathered outside the bakery, drawn by the news that was already spreading through Millbrook's tight-knit community. Through the broken window, she could see familiar faces wearing expressions of genuine happiness rather than the careful politeness she had grown accustomed to. Looks like we're going to have an audience for this courtship, Edward observed with amusement. Let them look, Carol replied, surprised by her own boldness. I'm done hiding from the world. And she was. The woman who had spent months trying to be invisible, who had allowed her scars to convince her that she was unworthy of love and happiness, was ready to step into the light and claim the life she deserved. Over the following weeks, as Millbrook recovered from Morrison's raids and life returned to something approaching normal, Carol found herself at the center of a community that had learned to see her differently. The story of her courage during the crisis had spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers and traders who stopped to hear about the scarred woman who had saved an entire town. But more important than the recognition from strangers was the change in how her neighbors treated her. She was no longer the object of pity or the recipient of charity, but a full member of the community whose opinions were sought and valued. When the town council met to discuss improvements to Millbrook's defenses, Carol was invited to participate. When the church organized relief efforts for other communities affected by raider attacks, she was asked to help coordinate the response. Edward proved to be everything she had hoped for and more. He was patient with her remaining insecurities, gentle with her fears, and unwavering in his conviction that she was exactly the woman he wanted to spend his life with. He bought property on the outskirts of town and began building a house designed for two people who intended to face whatever the future might bring together. The wedding was held on a crisp autumn morning with the entire town in attendance and Sarah serving as Carol's matron of honor. Even Jeremy Castillo was present, having overcome his initial hurt and disappointment to offer his genuine congratulations to the couple. His presence was a reminder that good people could disagree about important things and still maintain respect for each other. As Carol stood at the altar in her simple white dress, her scar clearly visible to everyone present, she felt none of the shame or self-consciousness that had plagued her for so long. Instead, she felt beautiful, valued, chosen by a man who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. The, the years that followed brought their share of challenges and joys, as all lives do. Edward's ranch prospered, helped by Carol's keen eye for business and her ability to manage the complex relationships between suppliers, workers, and customers. They faced droughts and floods, market fluctuations, and equipment failures, the thousand small crises that make up the texture of daily life on the frontier. They also faced more serious dangers. Morrison's gang did eventually regroup under new leadership, and there were other threats that arose from the unsettled nature of the territory. But Carol and Edward met each challenge as partners, their bond strengthened by shared adversity and mutual respect. Carol never completely lost her scars, of course. The mark on her face remained as visible as ever, a permanent reminder of the fire that had changed her life so dramatically. But she learned to see it differently, not as a symbol of damage, but as evidence of survival, not as proof of her unworthiness, but as testimony to her strength. Children came, 3 of them over the course of 7 years, and Carol discovered that motherhood suited her in ways she had never expected. Her children learned early that their mother was someone special, not because she was perfect, but because she had faced terrible things and chosen to respond with courage and compassion, rather than bitterness and retreat. The eldest, a daughter they named Hope, inherited Edward's gray eyes and Carol's determination. She grew up hearing the story of how her parents had met, how her mother had risked everything to save people she cared about, how her father had seen beauty in scars that others considered disfiguring. "Mama," Hope asked one evening as Carol tucked her into bed, "were you really afraid when you went to fight the bad men?" "Terrified," Carol replied honestly. "I was more frightened than I had ever been in my life." "Then why did you do it?" Carol considered the question seriously, wanting to give her daughter an answer that would serve her well in the years to come. "Because sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. Sometimes it means doing what's right even when you are afraid." "Will I be brave like you when I grow up?" "You're already brave," Carol said, smoothing Hope's dark hair away from her face. "You just haven't had a chance to prove it to yourself yet." As Carol left her daughter's room and made her way downstairs to where Edward was waiting by the fire, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning when she had first seen her scarred reflection in the cracked mirror. She had thought then that her life was over, that the fire had destroyed not just her face but her future. Instead, it had led her to discover who she really was underneath the surface that others found so important to judge. It had taught her that true beauty came from character rather than appearance, that love was about being seen and valued for who you were rather than what you looked like. Edward looked up from his book as she entered the parlor, his face lighting with the same smile that had first made her believe she might be worthy of love. "Children settled for the night?" "Finally, Carol replied, settling into the chair beside his. Hope wanted to hear the story again. "Which story?" "The one about how we met, how you saw beauty in my scars instead of being repelled by them." Edward set down his book and reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "I've been thinking about that story lately." "What about it?" "I think we've been telling it wrong," Edward said thoughtfully. "We always say that I saw beauty in your scars, but that's not quite accurate." Carol felt a flutter of unease. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I didn't see beauty in your scars," Edward explained gently. "I saw beauty in you, period. The scars were just part of who you were, like your blue eyes or your quick wit or your generous heart. They didn't make you beautiful, and they didn't make you ugly. They were simply part of the whole person I fell in love with." The distinction was subtle but important, and Carol felt something settle in her chest as she understood what he meant. For too long, she had thought of herself as someone whose scars needed to be overlooked or forgiven by others. Edward was reminding her that the right person wouldn't need to overlook anything, because they would love all of her without reservation or qualification. I love you, she said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything they had built together. I love you too, Edward replied. Scars and all, beauty and all, courage and all, every part of you, forever. Outside their warm home, the wind picked up across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of winter and the endless cycle of seasons that marked the passage of time on the frontier. But inside, by the fire they had built together, Carol and Edward Carter sat in the comfortable silence of two people who had found exactly what they were looking for in each other. The mirror in their bedroom no longer showed Carol a damaged woman, grateful for whatever kindness others might offer. Instead, it reflected a wife, a mother, a pillar of her community, a woman who had learned that true beauty came from the courage to keep living and loving, even when the world tried to convince her she wasn't worthy of either. Carol Mitchell Carter had walked through fire and emerged not just intact but transformed, not just surviving but thriving, not just existing but truly living. Her scars would always be visible, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they served as a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things in life are those that have been tested by adversity and proven strong enough to endure. The quiet farmer had indeed seen beauty, but not in the way the story was usually told. He had seen beauty in a woman who refused to let circumstances define her worth, who chose courage over safety, who built something meaningful on the foundation of her own survival. And in seeing her that way, he had helped her learn to see herself the same way, which was perhaps the greatest gift anyone could offer another person. The chance to discover their own worth through the eyes of someone who truly loved them. As the fire burned low and the house settled into the peaceful quiet of evening, Carol closed her eyes and smiled, surrounded by the life she had built from the ashes of the one she thought she had lost. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to be with, living exactly the life she had earned through her own courage and determination. The scarred woman had found her happy ending, not because her scars had disappeared, but because she had learned that they were never the end of her story. They were simply the beginning of a new chapter, one written in courage and love, and the unshakable knowledge that true beauty comes from within, and that the right person will always be able to see it shining through.